clock on the wall hit 11:59 p.m. Gyro sat alone in suffocating darkness. The only life in the $15 million Manhattan penthouse was the electric pulse of the skyline bleeding through floor-to-ceiling glass, casting a jagged silhouette of the man who ruled the city's shadows. He was draped across black leather, legs spread, his all-black shirt hanging open to reveal ink crawling up his throat like living armor. A single cigarette smoldered between his knuckles, smoke coiling into the void like a silent threat. He checked his heavy metal watch, 11:59 and 58 seconds p.m. The mechanical ticking was the only heartbeat in the room. 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. As undisputed head of the Kang Syndicate, Gyro had crushed empires and silenced rivals from New York to Miami. Yet here he sat, blood boiling over a housekeeper who was about to be exactly 2 seconds late. The fact that she held this much power over his composure made him feel a murderous, terrifying loss of control. 12 o'clock and 2 seconds a.m. The elevator hissed open. Gyro didn't move. He became the darkness itself. Audrey stepped in, dangerously professional in her tan blazer, her stride carrying an independence that felt like a challenge. She didn't see him, but the air turned to ice. Gyro rose from the shadows like a monolith of stone, his voice slicing through the silence with the edge of a razor. "You're late, Audrey. 2 seconds. Tell me, who was worth 2 seconds of my time?" Audrey's eyes swept the penthouse, searching for the light switch, her hand already reaching for the familiar routine of her shift. But the silence pressed against her eardrums like a living thing, and her fingers froze mid-air. Looking for something. Gyro's voice carved through the darkness, low and venomous. She spun toward the sound, her blazer suddenly feeling like paper armor. He was already moving, rising from the couch with the fluid menace of a panther closing distance on wounded prey. The cigarette tip glowed orange, illuminating the hard line of his jaw, the ink that crawled from collar to cheekbone like a brand of violence. "I asked you a question." He was 3 feet away now, then 2, his presence swallowing the oxygen in the room. "Who was worth 2 seconds of my time?" Audrey's spine straightened, a reflex she couldn't control even when survival screamed at her to bend. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Kang." His laugh was a blade scraping bone. "Don't insult me with ignorance." He flicked ash onto the marble floor, his eyes never leaving hers. 11:30 and 2 seconds p.m. "You walk through that elevator every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at exactly 11:30 p.m. tonight. You were late." Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Traffic on the..." "Traffic." Gyro closed the final step between them, forcing her back until her shoulders hit the cold glass overlooking the city's glittering throat. His hand slammed beside her head, the impact rattling the window. "I tracked your phone, Audrey. For 3 months. Every Wednesday. Every Friday. You disappear into the same building on 116th Street for exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. The air left her lungs. Columbia. He knew about Columbia. But he didn't know what she did there, and that meant he was guessing, building a narrative from shadows. His face was inches from hers now, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and expensive cologne, close enough to see the scar that split his left eyebrow, a reminder that someone had gotten close once before. "Who are you meeting?" His voice dropped to a whisper, more dangerous than any shout. "Is it the Volkov Bratva? The Philly outfit?" His free hand moved to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there like a promise. "Tell me which rival you're selling me to, and I'll make it quick." Audrey's pulse hammered beneath his palm, but she didn't flinch. She thought of her mother's hospital bed, the beeping machines, the bills that kept coming even after the funeral. She thought of the degree that was supposed to save them both, now hidden in a backpack under her bed like contraband. "I'm not selling you to anyone," she said, each word deliberate. "Then where do you go?" The pressure on her throat increased, just enough to feel the threat. "What are you hiding?" Her jaw tightened. If she told him about the night classes, he'd see weakness, debt, desperation. He'd own her completely, the way men like him always did when they found your soft places. But if she stayed silent, he'd fill in the blanks with enemies and betrayal, because that's what men like him always saw in shadows. She met his eyes, those dark, unreadable voids that had swallowed empires, and made her choice. "I don't owe you an explanation for my life outside these walls." For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Gyro's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, his thumb brushing the rapid flutter of her pulse. "That," he murmured, was the wrong answer. Gyro's thumb still pressed against her pulse when the memory hit. Columbia's ivy-covered gates at sunrise, her acceptance letter clutched in trembling hands, her mother's voice breaking with pride. "You're going to change our lives, baby girl." She had believed it once. Audrey forced herself back to the present, to the cold glass biting into her shoulder blades, to the predator who thought he owned her secrets. But the past was a hungry beast that never stopped feeding, and tonight it had her by the throat just as surely as Gyro did. Still nothing to say. His breath was hot against her cheek, his patience thinning like a wire about to snap. She swallowed hard, the motion pressing her throat harder against his palm. "You don't pay me enough to own my silence or my answers." His eyes flashed, surprise, then something darker, but he stepped back, releasing her. The absence of his touch should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the pause before an execution. Audrey turned toward the kitchen, her legs steadier than they had any right to be, and began the routine that had kept her alive for 8 months. Brewing his tea, laying out his files, erasing evidence of the violence that clung to everything he touched. Her hands moved on autopilot while her mind spiraled backward. She'd been 22 when the first hospital bill arrived, $47,000 for a single round of chemo. Her mother had smiled through the nausea, promising it would be okay, that the insurance would cover it. The insurance covered nothing. By month 3, Audrey had drained her scholarship fund. By month 6, she'd sold her childhood home for a fraction of its worth. By month 9, her mother was gone, and the debt was a $200,000 gravestone that followed Audrey everywhere. Columbia had sent the withdrawal confirmation on a Tuesday. She'd read it in the hospital chapel, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in for 3 days. "Miss Brooks." The voice had been smooth, accented, Dorian Wu, though she didn't know his name yet. He'd appeared in the chapel doorway like a shark scenting blood in the water. "I represent an employer who values discretion and pays generously for household services." Household services. The words had tasted like ash, but the number he'd written on the card, $8,000 a month, cash, had tasted like survival. Her first day in the penthouse, she'd met Gyro in this very kitchen. He'd been standing over a marble counter, wiping blood from a knife with the casual efficiency of a man cleaning a dinner fork. His eyes had swept over her once, a dismissal, a categorization, staff, irrelevant, invisible. "You're the new housekeeper." His voice had been ice wrapped in silk. "Yes, Mr. Kang. Don't touch the East Wing. Don't ask questions. Don't be late." He'd walked past her, and she'd caught the scent of tobacco and gunpowder, a combination that should have repelled her but instead burned itself into her memory like a brand. That night, she'd found the first suit, Armani, black, the collar stiff with dried blood. She'd soaked it in cold water, scrubbed until her knuckles bled, and hung it with the precision of a surgeon. Then she'd gone to the laundry room, pulled her corporate finance textbook from her bag, and studied until 3 a.m. because sleeping meant dreaming, and dreaming meant seeing her mother's face. She'd been doing it ever since. 2 nights a week, she attended night classes she couldn't afford, paying in installments she'd negotiated on her knees. The other nights, she studied in the laundry room where the hum of the machines drowned out the syndicate meetings in the rooms above. "You're thinking too loud." Gyro's voice cut through the memory, and Audrey realized she'd been standing at the sink, hands submerged in scalding water, for far too long. She pulled her hands free, skin red and angry, and turned to face him. He was watching her with the intensity of a man trying to solve an equation, his earlier rage replaced by something more dangerous, curiosity. "Who are you, Audrey Brooks?" The question was softer now, almost gentle, and that terrified her more than his threats ever could. Because if he started asking the right questions, he'd find the textbooks. He'd find the class schedule. He'd find the Columbia student ID she'd never had the heart to destroy. And then he'd know that the woman cleaning his blood-stained suits was supposed to be calculating derivatives in a corner office, not drowning in debt in his laundry room. "I'm no one," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Just your housekeeper." Gyro's smile was razor-sharp. "Liars have tells, Audrey. And yours just screamed the truth." The Cartier box sat on her bed like a coiled snake, navy velvet catching the morning light. Audrey stared at it for 3 full breaths before her hands moved, muscle memory from a life where opening gifts meant obligation, where generosity was just another word for chains. Inside, twin bracelets, white gold, paved diamonds running the length like captured starlight. The price tag would cover 2 semesters at Columbia. Her mother's voice echoed from the grave. Baby, when a powerful man gives you jewelry, he's not giving you a gift, he's buying a leash. Audrey snapped the box shut and walked it straight to Gyro's office, her pulsar war drum in her ears. She left it centered on his desk, a single note card beside it in her precise handwriting. I am your employee, not your property. She was folding laundry in the service room when she felt his presence. The air pressure changed, the way it does before a storm breaks. Gyro stood in the doorway, the Cartier box dangling from one finger like a dead thing. You think you're making a point? His voice was winter itself. I'm clarifying our arrangement. She didn't look up from the towel in her hands, creasing each edge with surgical precision. Our arrangement. He moved closer, invading her workspace with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been denied anything. You work in my home. You breathe my air. You exist because I allow it. He set the box on the dryer, too close to her hands. These are worth more than you'll earn in a year. Take them. No. The single syllable hung between them like a thrown gauntlet. Gyro's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin, and for a heartbeat she thought he might grab her wrist and force the diamonds onto her himself. Instead, he laughed, a sound with no humor in it, only dark fascination. You're the first person in a decade to refuse me. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her like a theorem he couldn't solve. Which means you either have a death wish, or you already have someone buying you prettier things. Her hand stilled on the towel. There it was, the accusation wrapped in silk. He wasn't trying to reward her. He was testing whether another man had already claimed her. I don't wear jewelry, she said flatly. Not from you. Not from anyone. But Gyro was a predator who interpreted rejection as challenge. The next morning, a strand of black pearls appeared on her pillow. Mikimoto, estate sale quality, the kind passed down through generations. She returned them before noon. By evening, emerald earrings materialized in the bathroom. She left them in his bourbon glass. A week passed. Diamond studs. A sapphire pendant. A vintage Rolex that could have cleared half her debt. Each one returned with the same silent defiance, each rejection carving deeper into whatever fragile pride he'd built his empire on. Audrey knew she was playing with fire. But accepting his gifts meant accepting the narrative he was writing, that she was a kept woman, a pretty thing to be adorned and controlled. Her mother had accepted gifts once, from a man who'd promised the world and delivered only bruises hidden beneath silk scarves. Never again. What Audrey didn't know was that Gyro had started watching the security feeds at 2 a.m., rewinding to study her face as she rejected each offering. He froze frames, zoomed in on her expressions, searching for cracks in her armor, a moment of hesitation, a flicker of want. He found nothing but that maddening composure, that steel spine that wouldn't bend even when logic said it should break. She was hiding something. Or protecting someone. The obsession that had begun as suspicion metastasized into something worse. He found himself timing his arrivals to the penthouse around her schedule, engineering reasons to occupy the same rooms, watching the way her fingers traced the spines of books she thought he didn't notice. Textbooks. Always textbooks. The air in the penthouse grew thick, suffocating, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with syndicate business and everything to do with the woman who cleaned his blood from Italian wool and refused to be bought. Gyro stood at his office window one night, staring at the city he owned, and realized with cold clarity that Audrey Brooks had become the only thing his money couldn't touch. Which meant she was either the most dangerous woman he'd ever met, or the only honest one. The file fell from behind the false panel in Gyro's closet while Audrey was rotating his winter suits, a manila folder, worn at the edges, with a single word written in Hangul she didn't recognize. She should have left it. Should have pretended the panel never shifted, that her fingers never brushed the hidden compartment. But the photograph slipping from the folder showed a woman in a wedding dress, and Audrey's hands moved before her mind could stop them. Una. The name was written on the back in Gyro's handwriting, the ink pressed so hard it had torn through the paper. She was beautiful in the way dangerous things are, sharp cheekbones, red lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The wedding dress was traditional, white silk and gold embroidery, but something about the way she held the bouquet looked wrong, like she was gripping a weapon instead of flowers. Audrey flipped to the next photo and her breath caught. Crime scene markers. Blood spatter analysis. A ceremonial knife embedded in a mattress, the sheets shredded like someone had fought for their life. The timestamp read 11:30 and 2 seconds p.m. 2 seconds. The assassination had been timed to the second, a meticulously planned murder disguised as a wedding night. Una had waited for Gyro to let his guard down, had smiled through the vows and the reception, had walked him to the bedroom like a lamb to slaughter. She'd been 2 seconds late pulling the blade. Find something interesting. Gyro's voice was a razor dragged across Audrey's spine. She spun, the file scattering across the floor, photos spreading like accusations. He stood in the doorway, shirt unbuttoned, blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his ribs. His face was a mask of fury and something rawer, violation, the look of a man whose deepest wound had just been exposed to daylight. I wasn't. The lie died in her throat because they both knew what she'd found, what she now understood about his obsession with time, with lateness, with a 2-second gap that had saved his life and destroyed his ability to trust. Get out. His voice was barely above a whisper, more dangerous than any shout. But Audrey's eyes caught on the blood spreading across his shirt, the way he was holding his left side like his ribs were grinding against each other. Her mother had died slowly, painfully, while doctors did nothing because the bills weren't paid. She'd sworn then that she'd never ignore suffering again, even when it wore a monster's face. You're bleeding through the bandage. She moved toward him before sense could intervene. Sit down before you pass out and crack your skull. I said get. I heard what you said. She was already guiding him to the bed, her hands firm on his shoulders despite the violence radiating from every line of his body. But you're going to bleed out from stubbornness, and I'm not scrubbing your blood out of this carpet. For a moment she thought he'd strike her. His hand lifted, trembling with barely controlled rage, but then his knees buckled and he sat hard on the mattress, his breathing shallow and pained. Audrey grabbed the first aid kit from the bathroom, her hand steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. When she returned, Gyro had removed his shirt, and the breath left her lungs. His back was a canvas of ink and scar tissue, dragons and demons and flowing script, all of it designed to hide the jagged lines carved into his skin. But up close, she could see where the tattoo artist had worked around the damage, where raised keloids disrupted the symmetry. Blade wounds. Dozens of them, concentrated around his spine and shoulder blades. Wedding night. The words burned in her mind as she cleaned the fresh wound on his ribs, her touch as gentle as she could manage while her heart cracked open for the man who'd been butchered by the woman he'd loved. She told me she was 2 seconds late because she stopped to fix her hair. Gyro's voice was hollow, distant. I believed her. Even laughed. His shoulders tensed under her hands. The blade went in right here. He pointed to a scar near his kidney. I woke up choking on my own blood while she apologized for missing my heart. Audrey's fingers stilled on his skin. She'd seen him as a predator, a monster, a man who wielded fear like a scalpel. But looking at these scars, at the evidence of a betrayal so intimate it had rewritten his ability to connect, she saw something else entirely. A man who'd loved once and nearly died for it. I'm sorry, she whispered, and meant it with a ferocity that surprised her. Gyro turned his head, catching her gaze over his shoulder. For the first time since she'd met him, the monster mask slipped completely, and she saw the raw terror underneath, the fear that everyone who got close was sharpening a blade in the dark. Don't be, he said quietly. Just don't be late again. Dorian Wu moved through Audrey's room like smoke, his gloved hands methodical as they placed the burner phone beneath her mattress, not hidden enough to avoid discovery, but hidden enough to look intentional. The device was a masterpiece of fabrication, encrypted texts to a Philadelphia number, GPS coordinates for syndicate warehouses, timestamps that aligned perfectly with her Wednesday and Friday absences. He'd spent 3 months building this lie, and tonight it would finally detonate. The door to Gyro's office was open when Dorian arrived, his expression carefully arranged into concern. Boss, we have a problem. He set the phone on the desk like a surgeon presenting a malignant tumor. I found this during a routine security sweep. It was in the housekeeper's room. Gyro's eyes went to the device, then back to Dorian, his face unreadable. Explain. Encrypted communications with a Philly outfit number. Meeting coordinates. Dates and times. Dorian pulled up the logs, watching Gyro's pupils dilate as the pattern emerged. 11:30 p.m. departures, Wednesday and Friday, locations within blocks of syndicate operations. She's been feeding them intelligence for months. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. Gyro picked up the phone, scrolling through messages that detailed shipment routes he'd personally overseen, names of informants only inner circle members knew. His jaw tightened, the scar through his eyebrow going white with pressure. Where did you find this? His voice was flat, empty of everything except the cold machinery of survival. Taped under her mattress. Dorian let the words hang, knowing Gyro would remember Yuna's knife hidden in an identical location, a wedding gift she'd claimed, discovered only after the blood had dried. Gyro set the phone down with surgical precision, his hand steady despite the tremor Dorian could see working through his shoulders. The trust that had been building between him and Audrey, the fragile, terrifying thing that had started when she'd touched his scars, was now a noose tightening around his throat. "Pull her GPS records for the past 6 months, Gyro said quietly. "I want every location cross-referenced with syndicate activity." "Already done." Dorian slid a tablet across the desk, the data damning in its precision. Every Wednesday and Friday, Audrey's phone pinged within a 3-block radius of the same building on 116th Street, a building that, according to the fabricated intelligence Dorian had planted, housed a Philly outfit front operation. The truth, that it was Columbia University's business school, would never cross Gyro's mind, because men like him didn't imagine housekeepers taking night classes. They imagined betrayal, because betrayal was the language they spoke fluently. "She played me." Gyro's voice was barely audible, a man talking to himself in the wreckage of his own stupidity. "I let her get close, and she played me." Dorian watched the transformation with satisfaction, the way Gyro's face hardened back into the monster mask, the way his hands curled into fists that could shatter bone. The servant girl had made Gyro soft, distracted, human. She'd made him forget that love was just another weapon people used before they struck. "What do you want me to do?" Dorian asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing yet." Gyro stood, walking to the window that overlooked his city, his empire, the kingdom he'd built on the bones of people who'd underestimated him. "I want to look her in the eyes when I ask her. I want to see if she'll lie to my face one more time." Dorian nodded and withdrew, leaving Gyro alone with his ghosts. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the service elevator just as it opened, and there she was, Audrey Brooks, carrying groceries, her Columbia textbook visible at the top of her bag. She froze when she saw him, some instinct warning her that the air had changed, that she was walking into a trap she couldn't see yet. Her eyes searched his face for answers, but Dorian only smiled, the kind of smile that promised nothing but ruin. "Evening, Miss Brooks," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Kang is waiting for you in his office." He watched her walk toward her execution, her spine straight despite the fear he could smell on her, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a problem finally solved. The penthouse was silent when Audrey entered, but it was the silence of a held breath before a scream. She set the groceries on the counter, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind catalogued every detail, the way the shadows seemed deeper, the way the air tasted like copper and impending violence. Gyro emerged from his office, the burner phone clutched in his hand, and Audrey's world tilted on its axis. She'd never seen that phone before in her life. But from the look in Gyro's eyes, the way he stared at her like she was Yuna reincarnated, like she was the knife hidden under the mattress, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that explanations wouldn't matter. He'd already decided she was guilty. Audrey waited until 3 a.m., when even predators slept, before she made her move. The burner phone sat on Gyro's desk like planted evidence, because that's exactly what it was. She'd never owned a secondary device, never encrypted a message in her life, but Gyro's eyes had already convicted her based on timestamps that matched her schedule too perfectly to be coincidence. Someone had studied her, weaponized her routine, and the only way to prove it was to break the one rule that guaranteed death. She bypassed the biometric scanner on Gyro's office using the emergency maintenance override, a code she'd memorized from watching the security team reset the system after a power outage. The door hissed open, and Audrey stepped into the forbidden sanctum, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a prisoner begging for release. The terminal glowed in the darkness, password protected with military-grade encryption. But Audrey had spent 4 years at Columbia studying financial systems, learning how institutions hid money trails, and syndicate security was just another ledger waiting to be cracked. She pulled up the burner phone's metadata, cross-referencing it with Gyro's own surveillance logs. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory from a life she'd lost taking over, and then, there. The timestamps didn't just match her Wednesday and Friday schedule. They matched it during the hours she was physically inside Columbia's Hamilton Hall, her student ID card logged by campus security, her laptop connected to the university's network. The burner phone had been active while she was provably elsewhere, which meant someone had been sending messages in her name while she was in corporate finance too. Her breath came faster as she pulled up the GPS coordinates from the phone. The meetings were supposedly happening at 116th and Broadway, the exact address of Columbia's business school. Whoever framed her had been lazy, assuming Gyro would never investigate closely enough to realize the Philly outfit safe house was actually a university building. Impressive. Dorian's voice sliced through the darkness like a blade through silk. I underestimated you, Miss Brooks. Audrey spun, her hand instinctively reaching for something, anything, to defend herself, but froze when she saw the silenced Glock leveled at her chest. Dorian stood in the doorway, his suit immaculate even at 3 a.m., his expression carved from the same ice that ran through his veins. It was you. The words tasted like copper in her mouth. You planted the phone. Of course I did. He stepped inside, and the door hissed shut behind him, the lock engaging with a mechanical finality that sounded like a coffin closing. You were making him weak. Soft. He stopped attending strategy meetings to watch you clean. He smiled at your defiance like it was charming instead of insubordination. Dorian's finger tightened on the trigger, the weapon steady as a surgeon's hand. Men like Gyro don't survive because they fall in love with housekeepers. They survive because they cut out the cancer before it metastasizes. Audrey's mind raced, calculating angles and distances, but there was nowhere to run in the locked office. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Baby girl, when a man points a gun at you, you make him hesitate, and she forced herself to meet Dorian's eyes with the same steel spine that had kept her alive this long. He'll know it was you. Her voice didn't shake, even though her legs wanted to buckle. The metadata proves I was in class. The GPS shows you fabricated the locations. Will he? Dorian tilted his head, almost curious. Or will he find your body slumped over his terminal, a suicide note confessing to espionage, too consumed by guilt to live? He gestured to the screen with his free hand. You broke into his office in the middle of the night. You were caught red-handed trying to delete evidence. It's a clean narrative. The silencer pressed against her sternum, cold even through her shirt, and Audrey realized with crystalline clarity that Dorian had been planning this moment since the day he'd recruited her from that hospital chapel. She'd never been hired to clean. She'd been hired to be a target, a scapegoat, a convenient betrayal to keep Gyro's paranoia sharp and his heart closed. He touched my scars. The words came from behind them, quiet and lethal as a blade drawn in darkness. Dorian's head whipped toward the voice, and Audrey saw Gyro standing in the doorway that shouldn't have been open, his eyes fixed on the gun pressed to her chest with an expression that transcended fury into something apocalyptic. Boss, I can explain. You have 3 seconds to take that weapon off her body before I paint this office with your brain matter. Gyro's voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which made it infinitely more terrifying. 1. Dorian's hand trembled, the first crack in his composure, but the gun didn't move. 2. Audrey felt the pressure of the silencer lift from her chest, but Dorian's finger was still on the trigger, his eyes wild with the desperate mathematics of a cornered animal deciding whether to fight or flee. Gyro's hand moved to his waistband, where she knew he kept a custom .45 that had ended more lives than she could count. 3. The gunshot never came. Dorian's calculation shifted in the split second before Gyro could fire. He swung the Glock toward Gyro instead, squeezing off 2 suppressed rounds that shattered the doorframe as Gyro dove left. The distraction cost Dorian his focus on Audrey, and that single heartbeat of inattention was all she had. Her mother's voice screamed through her mind, "Fight until your last breath, baby girl, because dying on your feet beats living on your knees," and Audrey's hand closed around the crystal award on Gyro's desk, some corporate recognition engraved with words she'd never read. She swung it with every ounce of strength her body could summon. The crystal connected with Dorian's temple with a wet crunch that would haunt her nightmares, and his body crumpled sideways, the gun clattering across the marble floor. Blood bloomed across his perfect hairline, but his chest was still rising and falling, which meant he had seconds, maybe less, before he woke up furious and homicidal. Audrey, G.O. Gyro's voice cracked like a whip as he returned fire, pinning Dorian's back up, 2 men she hadn't seen, behind the hallway corner. She ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted toward Gyro's bedroom, her lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come fast enough. Behind her, she heard Dorian's groan, the scrape of his body dragging itself upright, the ragged promise of vengeance in his cursing. The bedroom door slammed behind her, and her shaking hands found the biometric panel for the safe room, a reinforced cube inside the walk-in closet that Gyro had shown her once, drunk and vulnerable, making her memorize the override code just in case. She'd thought he was paranoid. Now she understood he'd been preparing her to survive him. The safe room door was 3 inches of ballistic steel, and it hissed shut just as Dorian's shoulder hit the bedroom door hard enough to crack the frame. Audrey collapsed against the wall, her vision tunneling, black spots dancing at the edges as her body finally registered what adrenaline had been masking. Pain. White hot and absolute, radiating from her left side where Dorian must have clipped her during the struggle. Not a bullet, but something sharp, maybe the corner of the desk, maybe his ring. Her shirt was wet, and when she pressed her hand to the wound, it came away red. The emergency phone was mounted on the wall, a direct line to Gyro's personal cell that bypassed all syndicate channels. Her fingers left bloody prints on the screen as she typed 3 words, because more than that would waste seconds she didn't have. Dorian traitor. Help. Send. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the wall, her back leaving a crimson smear on the white paint. The safe room had a full trauma kit, water, protein bars, enough to survive a siege, but her hands were shaking too badly to open the medical case. Outside, she heard wood splintering. Dorian was coming through the bedroom door. 12 miles across Manhattan, Gyro's phone vibrated during a syndicate strategy meeting where he was supposed to be negotiating a truce with the Volkov Bratva. He'd left Audrey alone in the penthouse because Dorian had insisted the meeting required his immediate presence, because he trusted his second-in-command with the woman who'd somehow become more important than his empire. He glanced at the screen, and his world stopped. Dorian traitor. Help. 3 words that rewrote his entire reality, that confirmed what his heart had been screaming since he'd found that burner phone. Audrey wasn't the spy. She'd never been the spy. And he'd left her alone with the man who was. Meeting's over. Gyro stood, his chair slamming backward hard enough to crack against the wall. The Bratva boss started to protest, but something in Gyro's face, some raw, feral terror, made him go silent. Gyro didn't run to the elevator. He vaulted over the table and kicked open the emergency stairwell, taking the stairs 4 at a time while his phone burned in his hand. Full tactical response, he barked into his earpiece. Every available unit to the penthouse. Dorian Wu is the target. Shoot to neutralize, and if Audrey Brooks has a scratch on her, I want him alive so I can kill him slowly. His driver was already pulling the car around when Gyro hit the ground floor, and he threw himself into the back seat, his .45 in one hand, his phone in the other, watching the blinking dot of Audrey's location, still inside the safe room, still transmitting, which meant she was still alive. But for how long? The city blurred past his window, and for the first time in a decade, Gyro prayed to a god he'd stopped believing in the night Yuna's blade had kissed his spine. Let me get there in time. Please. Just let me get there in time. Gyro hit the penthouse at full speed, 6 armed men flowing behind him like a tidal wave of controlled violence. The front door didn't slow them. Shaped charges blew the hinges clean off, and they poured through the smoke with weapons raised, clearing rooms with the precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times. But Gyro wasn't leading a raid. He was hunting the man who'd touched what was his. He found Dorian in the master bedroom, fingers flying across a tablet connected to the safe room's override system, his temple caked with dried blood and his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered rat. The man didn't even have time to turn before Gyro's boot connected with his spine, slamming him face first into the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Boss, I can explain. Dorian's words died as Gyro's forearm crushed his throat, pinning him like an insect to a board. The only explanation I want is why you're still breathing. Gyro's voice was a surgical instrument, each word carved from ice and fury. He didn't wait for an answer, just drove his knee into Dorian's kidney hard enough to make him vomit onto the expensive carpet. 2 of Gyro's men dragged Dorian away, but Gyro had already forgotten he existed. His hands were on the safe room panel, entering the emergency override, his heart a hammer against his ribs as the steel door hissed open. Audrey was slumped against the far wall, her shirt soaked through with blood, her skin the color of old paper. But her eyes were open, tracking his movement, and when she tried to smile, that stubborn, defiant smile that had broken through his armor, blood flecked her lips. You're late, she whispered, and the words cracked something fundamental in Gyro's chest. He caught her as she pitched forward, his arms closing around her like she was made of glass and dynamite, something precious and explosive that he'd been too blind to protect. Her weight was nothing. She'd lost pounds she didn't have to lose, and when he pressed his hand to the wound on her side, the blood was already cooling. Get the trauma surgeon, he barked at his men, but his eyes never left her face. The one from Mount Sinai. Tell him I'll pay triple his annual salary if he's here in 10 minutes. His crew scattered, phones already out, but one of them, Marcus, his oldest lieutenant, didn't move. He was staring at Audrey with the recognition of a man who'd seen too many bodies go cold, and his expression told Gyro everything he didn't want to know. They were running out of time. Gyro lifted Audrey into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he strode toward the elevator. His men parted like water, their weapons still drawn, but their eyes were on their boss holding a woman like she was the only thing in the world worth saving. "This is the woman I love." Gyro's voice rang through the penthouse, a declaration and a warning and a funeral oration all at once. "Anyone who touches her answers to me. Anyone who failed to protect her answers to me." He stepped into the elevator, Audrey's blood soaking into his shirt. "And anyone who doubted her loyalty can join Dorian in whatever hell I decide he deserves." The doors closed on his crew's stunned faces, but Gyro was already focused on Audrey, on the way her breathing had gone shallow and rapid, on the heat radiating from her skin like a furnace burning itself out. "Stay with me," he ordered, the same tone he used to command armies, but his hand was gentle as it brushed the hair from her forehead. "That's an order, Audrey." Her eyes fluttered open, fever-bright and unfocused. "I didn't betray you." Each word cost her, and Gyro felt the shame of his doubt like acid in his throat. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry." He pressed his lips to her forehead, tasting salt and sickness, and felt her body convulse with a cough that brought up blood. Too much blood, the kind that meant internal damage, the kind that meant they were losing. The elevator opened to the lobby where an ambulance was already waiting, lights flashing, paramedics moving with controlled urgency. But as they reached for Audrey, she coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that had nothing to do with Dorian's attack and everything to do with something far more insidious. The lead paramedic's eyes met Gyro's over Audrey's body, and his expression shifted from urgent to grave. "How long has she been coughing blood?" "What?" Gyro's mind was still on Dorian, on the wound in her side, on the frame-up and the fear and the hemoptysis, the fever. "How long?" The paramedic was already checking her lymph nodes, his fingers finding swelling that made his jaw tighten. "Sir, this isn't from trauma. She needs oncology, not a trauma surgeon." The word hit Gyro like a bullet he never saw coming. Oncology. He looked down at Audrey, at the woman who defied him and challenged him and touched his scars with hands that trembled but never broke, and understood with terrible clarity why she'd been so thin, so tired, so desperate to finish something, anything, before time ran out. She was dying. Not from Dorian's gun or his planted evidence or the violence of the syndicate. She was dying from the same beast that had devoured her mother, and she'd hidden it behind that spine of steel because asking for help meant admitting defeat. Gyro climbed into the ambulance beside her, his hand gripping hers, and watched the paramedics work with the numb detachment of a man realizing he'd won the battle but lost the war. He'd saved her from Dorian. But he couldn't save her from herself. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and endings. Audrey lay in the bed, tubes running from her arms like the tentacles of some medical jellyfish trying to keep her tethered to a world she was already leaving. The lymphoma had metastasized faster than the oncologists predicted. Aggressive, they'd called it, as if cancer needed a personality trait to justify its cruelty. Gyro hadn't left her side in 72 hours, but sleep was a luxury for people who weren't watching the woman they loved dissolve into transparency. "He's here." Gyro's voice was hoarse from disuse as he stood, smoothing the wrinkles from his shirt like it mattered, like presentation could somehow make this moment less obscene. Dean Catherine Morrison entered with the gravity of someone who'd done this before, bedside conferrals for students who'd run out of time before they ran out of potential. She carried a leather portfolio embossed with Columbia's seal, and her eyes held the kind of professional compassion that Audrey would have hated under any other circumstance. But Audrey's eyes lit up when she saw it, a spark of the brilliant scholar she'd been before debt and disease had tried to erase her. "Miss Brooks." The dean pulled a chair close, her voice gentle. "The faculty committee reviewed your coursework, your thesis on predatory lending practices in medical debt acquisition, and your academic record. It is my profound honor to confer upon you the degree of Master of Science in Financial Management, with distinction." Gyro watched Audrey's face transform, the pain line smoothing, the exhaustion fading, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Her fingers, skeletal now, reached for the diploma with the reverence of someone touching something holy. "I did it," she whispered, and the words broke on a cough that brought up blood she tried to hide in the tissue. "Mama, I did it." The dean stepped back, her professional mask cracking just enough to show the grief underneath, and quietly left them alone. Gyro sank back into the chair beside Audrey's bed, lifting her hand, so light now, like holding a bird's hollow bones, and pressed it against his scarred cheek. "You never stopped fighting," he said, his voice fracturing. Even when I was too blind to see it. Audrey's smile was the saddest beautiful thing he'd ever seen. I had to finish. Had to prove. Her breathing hitched, labored. Prove she didn't die for nothing. That the debt didn't win. It didn't. Gyro's thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture of tenderness he'd never learned until her. You won, Audrey. You graduated. You beat them. But even as he said it, he knew the victory was ash, because the cancer didn't care about diplomas or justice or the fact that the universe owed this woman decades she'd never get. Audrey's eyes found his, clear despite the morphine, and her next words came out barely audible, each syllable a gift she was choosing to give with her last strength. I was never late for you, Gyro. Her grip tightened on his hand, urgent. I was just early for heaven. The heart monitor's steady beat began to slow, each tone stretching longer, a countdown Gyro couldn't stop. His free hand fumbled for the call button, but Audrey's fingers caught his wrist, holding him in place. Don't. Her voice was fading, a radio signal losing frequency. Stay. Just stay. So he did. He climbed into the hospital bed beside her, pulling her fragile body against his chest, his arms a fortress that couldn't protect her from the only enemy that mattered. He felt her heartbeat against his palm, irregular now, skipping measures like a song forgetting its rhythm. I love you, he said into her hair, the words he'd been too damaged to speak when they might have mattered. I love you, I love you, I. The monitor flatlined. The sound was a knife dragged across the universe's throat, and Gyro's scream shattered the antiseptic silence, a sound of pure, animalistic grief that brought nurses running and sent his own men, waiting in the hallway, to their knees. He held her as her body went still, as the warmth leached from her skin, as the woman who defied him and challenged him and somehow loved him despite the monster he'd been turned into absence in his arms. And in that moment, staring at her peaceful face, finally free from pain, from debt, from the burden of surviving in a world designed to crush people like her, Gyro understood. She hadn't been late that night because she was betraying him. She'd been racing against a clock far more merciless than his watch, trying to pack a lifetime of purpose into the months she had left, fighting to prove her mother's sacrifice meant something before the same disease came to collect its debt. Every 2-second delay had been her stealing time from death itself. And he'd been too broken to see it. 1 year later, Gyro stood on the rooftop of what used to be a syndicate warehouse and was now the headquarters of something that would have made Audrey laugh, a non-profit with his blood money converted into scholarships and medical debt forgiveness. The skyline had changed. Or maybe he had, and the city just looked different through eyes that had learned to see past concrete and steel to the people drowning beneath it. His left hand was naked of the platinum rings that had marked him as Kang's syndicate royalty. Instead, a simple gold band hung from a chain around his neck, Audrey's graduation ring, the one Columbia had presented alongside her diploma, engraved with her mother's initials on the inside where no one but him would ever see. He touched it now, a reflex that had replaced his old habit of checking his watch obsessively. Time didn't matter the same way anymore. Not when the woman he'd been racing against the clock for had already crossed the finish line without him. Mr. Kang. A voice pulled him from the edge of his thoughts, a young woman, maybe 23, her eyes bright with a kind of hope Gyro had forgotten existed. She clutched a folder against her chest like a shield. I wanted to thank you. The Gloria Brooks Foundation cleared my mother's medical debt. $340,000. I was going to drop out of nursing school to work, but... Her voice cracked. This foundation saved my life. Gyro studied her face, the determination in her jaw, the exhaustion around her eyes, the stubborn pride that refused to be broken by a system designed to devour people like her. She looked exactly like Audrey had that first night, standing in his penthouse with a spine of steel and a future being stolen one hospital bill at a time. What's your mother's prognosis? The question came out rougher than he intended. Remission. 3 months clean. The girl's smile was sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She gets to see me graduate now. Something twisted in Gyro's chest, not quite pain, not quite peace, but the space between them where healing was supposed to happen. Then make it count, he said. Finish what you started. That's what she would have wanted. The girl nodded, tears cutting clean lines down her cheeks, and walked away clutching her second chance like the miracle it was. Gyro had liquidated everything, the warehouses, the offshore accounts, the web of violence and influence that had taken him decades to build. 5,000 students had received letters last month, Generic notices that their medical debt had been purchased and forgiven by an anonymous donor. The syndicate's former accountants now processed scholarship applications. His soldiers retrained as security for non-profit clinics in neighborhoods where hospitals refused to operate. Dorian's blood money had bought Audrey's legacy, and Gyro slept better in his modest apartment than he ever had in the penthouse. He drove to the cemetery as the sun began its descent, the bouquet of lilies on the passenger seat filling the car with their heavy, sweet scent. Her favorite, though she'd only admitted it once, half asleep in his arms after a particularly brutal chemo session. Her grave was simple. She would have hated anything ostentatious. Audrey Gloria Brooks. Beloved daughter, scholar, warrior. She chose light. Gyro knelt, placing the lilies against the headstone, his fingers tracing her name like Braille. 5,000 this year, he said quietly. Next year, we're expanding to cover housing costs. Your thesis on predatory lending, the foundation's using it to lobby for policy reform. He paused, his throat tightening. You were right. About all of it. About me. The memory hit him without warning, a flashback so vivid he could smell the coffee and hear her laugh. It had been 3 months before she died, before Dorian's frame-up, before everything shattered. Audrey had been washing dishes in the penthouse kitchen at 2 a.m., and Gyro had been watching her from the doorway, struck by the absurd domesticity of a mob boss falling in love with his housekeeper. He'd walked over, taken the sponge from her hands, and pulled her into a slow dance to music only they could hear. She'd laughed, surprised and delighted, and let him lead her around the kitchen in her cleaning uniform and bare feet, her head against his chest where his heart was hammering out a truth he'd been too afraid to speak. You're a terrible dancer, she'd whispered. You're stuck with me anyway, he'd replied. And for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, they'd been just two people swaying in a kitchen, unburdened by debt or disease or the violence that defined his world. Gyro stood now, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that Audrey would have called aggressively hopeful. He touched the ring at his throat one last time, then turned toward his car, toward the foundation headquarters, toward the 500 applications waiting on his desk from students who needed someone to believe their lives were worth saving. We chose the light, Audrey, he whispered to the wind, to her ghost, to the woman who'd somehow pulled a monster into redemption with nothing but her stubborn refusal to be broken. And I'm going to make sure it reaches every corner of the darkness we came from. He walked forward, leaving fresh lilies and old ghosts behind, carrying her name into a future she'd never see but had somehow made possible. The city stretched before him, full of people drowning in the same debt that had killed her. And Gyro had a fortune's worth of blood money left to spend on making sure they got the second chance she never did.